Welcome. Today, we're diving straight into some of the really important financial and economic news that's been making the rounds lately.
Yeah, we've got a collection of insights here pulled from an English daily money briefing. It's dated April 14th.
So consider this your quick but, pretty comprehensive update on what's been happening and maybe why it matters to you.
Exactly. This briefing, it hits on several key things: international trade, domestic market pressures, currency movements, quite a mix.
Nurgle.
Well, basically, to pull out the really crucial bits, give you some clarity and context without getting bogged down in, all the tiny details.
Okay, let's do it. So the briefing starts with the U.S. and China, trade stuff. Specifically, some new mutual tariff exclusions. What's the story there?
Right. So the U.S. government has announced that certain goods, specific categories, will be exempt from tariffs between the U.S. and China now.
Okay, which goods are we talking about?
It's a pretty tech-heavy list, actually. Things like smartphones, laptops, hard disk drives, computer processors, memory chips, even equipment for making semiconductors.
That is very focused on tech. Any idea what the thinking is behind excluding these particular items?
Well, it seems a big part of it is worry about prices going up for U.S. consumers, things like iPhones, mostly made in China.
Ah, right. So tariffs could mean higher prices for those?
Exactly. So these exclusions look like they're meant to ease that specific pressure. But, what's interesting here,
Yeah.
it's maybe not just about consumer prices. Targeting these tech components, it could signal a bit of, well, maybe a subtle adjustment in the whole U.S. decoupling strategy.
How so?
Like maybe an acknowledgement that in this specific tech area, the supply chains are just so intertwined, you can't easily pull them apart without causing major disruption.
That's a really interesting angle. It suggests maybe a more pragmatic approach in certain sectors.
Could be. It definitely makes you wonder if other sectors might see similar tweaks down the line.
And the briefing mentions specific companies that might be breathing a bit easier because of this.
Oh, yeah. Sources like Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, they pointed to big names: Samsung Electronics, Apple, Dell, NVIDIA, TSMC too.
Right. The major players, giants in electronics, semiconductors. Makes sense tariff relief would matter a lot to them.
Huge impact on their operations, their bottom line potentially. These global supply chains are incredibly complex.
Okay, so good news for some big tech firms. Now, just to get the context right, what's the general tariff situation between the U.S. and China? The briefing mentioned some numbers.
Yeah, it's pretty complex. The U.S. has tariffs up to, I think, 125% on a lot of Chinese goods.
Wow, 125.
Yeah. And then it's 10% on goods from other countries. Plus, there's this separate 10 plus 10% tariff on China, specifically linked to drug enforcement efforts.
So these new exemptions are basically carving out specific products from that rather high baseline.
Precisely. It's a targeted adjustment within a bigger, more complicated structure.
And this isn't the first time we've seen exclusions, right? The briefing mentioned President Trump made some earlier ones.
That's right. There were previous exclusions for things like steel, cars, even semiconductors and pharmaceuticals were excluded from some mutual tariffs earlier.
Although, didn't it say those were already facing other tariffs?
Yes, exactly. Some already had or were about to face pretty hefty tariffs, like 25%. So this latest move is, another step in this ongoing process of targeted tariff adjustments.
It's fascinating how these big trade moves play out. You mentioned the complex supply chains. Could this U.S.-China thing, these specific exclusions, indirectly affect, say, South Korea's economy?
Oh, absolutely. That's a really important point. While it's directly U.S.-China, the ripples definitely spread.
In what way?
Well, think about South Korean tech companies. They compete in many of the same markets. Changes in the competitive dynamics between U.S. and Chinese firms, maybe due to these tariff changes, could shift demand or pricing power.
So it could make things harder or easier for them, depending on the specifics.
Exactly. It just shows how interconnected everything is. One move between two big players sends waves everywhere else.
Right. Highlights that interconnectedness. Okay, let's shift focus now specifically to South Korea. The briefing also talked about a worrying trend there in the domestic service sector, accommodation and food services.
Yes, that was another key point. It described a really unusually long downturn in those sectors within South Korea.
How bad is it? What did the numbers show?
Well, the main indicator they used is the production index for accommodation and food services. For February, it was at 103.8, using 2020 as the 100 baseline.
Okay, and how does that compare?
That's actually a 3.8% decrease compared to the same month the previous year.
Almost 4% down in a year? Oh, not great. But you said long-term slump.
Yeah, that's the really striking part. This index, it fell basically every single month from May 2023 right through to February 2024.
Every month.
Pretty much. There was just one flat month in January 2023, apparently. But otherwise, a continuous slide. The report actually called it the longest slump on record since they started tracking this data back in 2000.
The longest slump since 2000.
Yeah.
That's significant. What's driving this? Any ideas, Mashin?
The main culprit seems to be weakness in domestic demand.
Yeah.
People just aren't spending as much.
Okay.
But it also floated the idea that maybe past trade policies like the Trump administration tariffs, plus maybe some domestic political uncertainty, that these could be dampening consumer confidence.
So a mix of internal demand issues and maybe some external or political factors weighing on people's minds.
Potentially, yeah. And the consequence is, naturally, growing concern about a possible crisis for, self-employed people, small business owners, the ones who really depend on those sectors.
Yeah, those are often the folks hit hardest. So this isn't just some abstract number. It's really about livelihoods.
Exactly. It's a reminder of how vulnerable some domestic sectors are, especially the ones tied closely to how much consumers feel comfortable spending.
And it also shows how, big international trade decisions can eventually filter down and impact local businesses and individual finances.
Absolutely. The ripple effect again.
Okay, so one last major piece from this briefing. Staying with South Korea, but shifting to its currency, the won. There was talk about volatility and even mentions of a possible second foreign exchange crisis. That sounds pretty alarming.
It definitely catches your attention, that phrase. And the briefing did acknowledge that the exchange rate has been fluctuating quite sharply recently. It's been hovering near that 1,401 to the U.S. dollar mark.
And that kind of movement makes people nervous, brings back memories of past crises.
Understandably, yes. Comparisons to the big crisis in the late 90s, 1997-98, inevitably come up when you see that kind of volatility.
But the experts quoted in the briefing, they weren't buying that comparison.
No, not really. The dominant view presented there is that South Korea's fundamental economic situation today is, and I think the phrase was, qualitatively different from back then.
Qualitatively different, meaning stronger, more resilient.
Essentially, yes. While they see the exchange rate moving around, they stress that the underlying economy is built on much firmer ground now compared to the late 90s.
And did they offer specific reasons? Data points?
They did. The briefing pointed to South Korea's very large foreign exchange reserves, over 400 billion U.S. dollars now.
Yeah.
That's a huge cushion.
Okay, big reserves. What else?
Also, the fact that the country consistently runs a current account surplus. Basically, it's earning more from the rest of the world than it's spending. That's a sign of strength.
Right. Earning more than spending.
And finally, they mentioned the global credit rating agencies. They've kept South Korea's national credit ratings stable. They aren't signaling major alarm bells.
So reserves are strong, trade balance is positive, credit ratings are stable, despite the one bouncing around a bit.
That seems to be the picture, yes.
So what's the final word from the experts on this currency situation?
The takeaway message in the briefing was really a call for, well, they used the term calm analysis. Basically, don't panic just because the exchange rate looks unstable.
Look deeper.
Exactly. Monitor it, understand the broader context, the underlying economic strengths that are there. Avoid excessive fear.
Okay, so for our listeners tracking global indicators, the lesson is currency volatility isn't always a 5-alarm fire, especially if the fundamentals look solid. You need the whole picture.
Precisely. It really highlights why you need that data-driven analysis, expert views, rather than just reacting to, scary headlines.
All right, let's try and wrap this up then. We've covered quite a bit from this single English Daily Money briefing.
We have, starting with those U.S. tariff exclusions, the tech focus, who benefits.
Right. Then that really concerning long slump in South Korea's accommodation and food service sectors, the domestic demand weakness.
Potentially linked to wider trade issues and consumer confidence, yeah.
Yeah.
And finally, the one's fluctuations, but with experts cautioning against panic, pointing to strong fundamentals.
Thanks for taking this deep with us.
English Daily Money Briefing.